Welcome to the Exploring Unschooling podcast. I'm Pam Laricchia, longtime unschooling mom and author. Join me and my wonderful guests for interviews, information, and inspiration about unschooling and living joyfully with your family. You can find the episode show notes, your free introductory ebook, What is Unschooling, and lots more information at livingjoyfully.ca. And here's the show. Hello, everyone. I'm Pam Laricchia, and this is episode number 119 of the podcast. It's the 11th of April, 2018, as I record this intro. This week on the podcast, I speak with Xander MacSwan. Xander left school in the 5th grade when his parents, both professors in the University of Maryland's College of Education, decided the best thing they could do was pull their kids out of school and start unschooling. We have such a fun and amazing conversation, diving deep into Xander's passion for video games, including the difference between gaming as part of deschooling and choosing gaming as a passion, the joys of gaming, and things he learned or experienced through gaming that continue to be relevant in his life. As a personal update this week, I happened to see there were new podcast reviews posted recently. Yay, thank you. So I thought I'd share a snippet from a few of them. Episode by episode, Pam and her guests are inspiring me and breaking apart the beliefs my upbringing made me think are truths or facts. But far from it, I'm greatly enjoying considering the unschooling way of life for my children and testing it out more and more each day. Another wrote, I'd been unschooling for a few years when I found this podcast, and it has changed things in our home and our life so much. I feel so much more confident in our journey, and I'm realizing when the fears creep in about things, it's now my cue to dig deeper into that topic instead of questioning everything I've done this far. And another one wrote, I can't tell you how much of a positive impact having these regular unschooling voices pop up in my podcast feed is for me. Hearing conversations and stories from those who've been treading this path for longer and hearing so many positive stories of unschooling lives is so helpful in allowing me to live joyfully in our own unschooling life. Thanks so much to everyone who has taken the time to write a review. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to know that you're finding the podcast helpful on your unschooling journey. And a huge thank you to everyone who has chosen to support the show on Patreon. A big welcome to new patrons Sarah Mitchell and Cricket Matherly. And thanks to Caitlin Walker for increasing her pledge. Thanks, Caitlin. I deeply appreciate all my patrons and their generous support. It's vital to helping me share unschooling information and inspiration with anyone who wants to explore the fascinating world of unschooling. If you'd like to support the show, even for as little as $1 a month, check out the Exploring Unschooling page at patreon.com. That's patreon.com/exploring unschooling. And this week's quote is from Xander. To me, one of the most valuable parts of unschooling is the unconditional positive regard and acceptance that a parent can give to a kid. Just that sense of trusting that it's okay to be myself and it's okay to do what feels good and take care of myself. I think that's such a huge thing to be able to give a young and developing mind. And really, there's nothing more I can add to that, is there? So let's get to my conversation with Xander. Hi everyone, I'm Pam Laricchia from livingjoyfully.ca, and today I'm here with Xander MacSwan. Hi Xander!
Hi Pam, it's such a delight to be here.
Hey, I'm so excited to chat with you. Just as a quick introduction, I first came across Xander through an episode he did with Blake Bowles for the Off Trail Learning podcast. I really loved what he had to share, and I wanted to talk more with him about his experience growing up unschooling. I was thrilled when he agreed to chat with me. So, to get us started, Xander, can you share with us a bit about you and your family?
Yeah, that'd be my pleasure. So I have been, I was unschooled growing up for most of my life. I did go to public school, during the elementary school years. I dropped out in, I believe, the 5th grade. And my transition was a little bit unusual from what I usually see in the unschooling community, which is that my parents are both professors in University of Maryland's College of Education. And so they were, especially my mom, I think, was really involved in looking at uh, just studies on human learning and child brain development. And it became really apparent to them, sort of from that perspective, that the best thing they could do for their kids, me and my two siblings, would be to pull us out of school. And so for me, it was a decision that came from my parents.
So yeah, how were you feeling about school at the time?
I was sort of mixed or neutral about it.
Yeah.
I think I did well in school.
Mm-hmm.
I think that though I have a lot to say on sort of the structures and systems of school, I think there are some types of sort of thinking that can succeed within the systems that school sets. And I think that I was able to sort of pass on tests and perform in that way. And so I had a sense of sort of like acceptance within school, and was told that I was good.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like a positive experience in that sense. But I definitely don't think that I was like learning or growing in a really, truly meaningful way in school.
Oh, that's such a great point.
Yeah. So I think the unschooling shift definitely made a really huge difference for the better in my life, even though I was getting good grades and school was, telling me that I was doing well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting to hear. Like in my situation, I did fine in school, and it wasn't until later, when I had kids and started actually thinking about the system, but it was because my son wasn't doing well. That was the trigger for me to start looking and to start questioning things. So it's so interesting that it was, I guess, specifically your mom's work in education that was the trigger for her to start questioning things. I do know of a few unschooling parents who are like at colleges and universities in the education department, like professors of education who are choosing to unschool their own children. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think there was, a mix too. Like as a kid, we would often take family vacations or like miss days or sometimes a week of school to just go adventuring.
Yep.
And my parents really quickly saw like the difference in me and my siblings when we were away from school or at school. Largely in just like how happy we were and how it like the sense of sort of delight and awe that we would have. And it really lined up for them with the research they were doing, that those moments where we were really fully engaged with being where we were and sort of soaking in the experience of something new was when we were really learning and really growing. So it made a lot of sense to them to make that the primary focus of our youth and our sort of education.
So did you notice a big difference? Like once you left school, was it more just back to those, vacation days or whatever, those days that you spent hanging out with your parents? Did you just kind of dive right into that, or was there more of a transition?
Yes and no. I would say there was a transition, especially in the last sort of few years or year or two of my schooling. I was starting to take it more and more seriously. Mm-hmm. And so wouldn't go as often on days off or like family vacations, because it became really important to me to have my teachers, look at me and say I was doing well and give me good grades.
Yeah.
Which I think was of course so common. And so I would like stay home and work really hard on homework and go to school and try really hard to succeed in a way where I could be acknowledged. And so in our last few years, I got more and more sort of into the swing of sort of where I think school can start to really disserve the human mind, which is for me when learning becomes a really forced process.
Yeah.
and one that's intention isn't to grow, but to sort of perform and I could say maybe like prove yourself or like be seen as having accomplishment under this very specific sort of set of criteria.
So how did you find that transition? Because you had bought into, not that definition of learning, right? To be seen as
Yes.
as accomplishing and doing well within that system. And learning looks very different outside of school, right? So
Totally.
was it hard? I can imagine, maybe at first it's like, well, I'm not learning anything, I'm having fun, but then after a while starting to worry maybe about whether or not you were learning. Was that something that you went through?
Yes, I think so. And I think it was offset largely because I did have a lot of trust for my parents. And since my parents were so confident
Yeah.
that, that my life was going to be better if I unschooled,
Yeah.
I believed in that. And I did definitely go through, to some degree, the classical deschooling process.
Yeah.
So spent quite a bit of time just like turned off at home, watching TV and playing video games. And I think we're going to talk more about that later. But just going into sort of this deep recovery mode. To me is what the deschooling process is.
Yeah, I mean, and as you say, that does lead perfectly into the next question, doesn't it? Because one of the common worries for newer unschooling parents is around whether or not to limit the time their children spend, watching TV or specifically playing video games. And as you alluded to, there's a difference between deschooling and choosing gaming as a passion, though at first it might be really hard to distinguish between them. So I was hoping you could talk about the difference.
Yes, definitely. So just to go over a little bit in case anyone listening is new to deschooling or unschooling, the idea with deschooling is that very commonly there's a period of time after a kid leaves school. It seems to me to range from 6 months on the very high end, maybe up to 2 years, where really that kid is recovering from the sort of mental state that school often puts kids into, which is one of really repetitive activity and very low creative engagement. And that kind of experience drawn over the length of time that it does in school can be a little bit traumatic. And so for a lot of kids, there's this long period of time where they're sort of going into recovery, and almost you can think of it as just resting. Like their brain needs time to sort of rearrange itself and wake up to the possibility of being really like present and engaged as sort of the independent and free like driving force in your own life. And so for me, what that looked like was I went home and I would lay on the couch all day and either watch TV or play video games. And I think what was happening for me is I was just getting some minimal source of stimulation, but the main sort of intention or focus on a subconscious level was to rest and to give myself time to sort of like recover. And there's a big difference between the way I engaged with media in that state and the way I engaged with media afterwards. What typically happens, I think, is that during this deschooling process, even when someone's engaging with something like a TV or a movie, there's a little bit of like a glazed look to them. Like they're just sort of passive in that engagement. And that can be really scary for unschooling parents who are new to see their kids come out of school and be in this sort of in this state that really doesn't look like they're getting much out of the unschooling process because they're not really moving in a tangible way. But then inevitably there's this incredibly beautiful moment in every story I've heard where one morning the kid wakes up and comes into the kitchen and says, "Mom, I really want to learn how to cook. can you show me how to make pancakes? Or Mom, I really want to read this book. And there's this explosion where this like recovery sort of hits a critical mass, and the kid is able to re-engage with creative development and intellectualism.
I really love that, because it's so true. The parents, when they've chosen unschooling and their kid comes home from school, like they're all excited, right? They're like, oh, we can do all these things. We can do all these things.
Totally.
And then their poor child, like, because on one level, deschooling is a little easier to understand if your child has had more traumatic experiences at school, right? It's like, oh, they need to recover from that. But you're absolutely right. There is that whole system that we've just really internalized, right? Of how we learn, and even just how we're told what to do. We've always been told what to do and kept busy, and that cocooning to be able to relax and release all that kind of programming, for lack of a better word, and to regather your agency. Like you said, one day they wake up and they want to do something. Something has struck their interest and they're ready to do that. But it can be a scary time when they cocoon just when parents think they've released them onto the world, right?
Yes, totally. Because humans are such like creative and adventurous creatures.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, just like you said, that there's a lot to sort of the subtle ways that school can start to inhibit or take that away from kids, both through things like limiting sort of creative engagement, and also I think like you were saying, on a social level, not really having a lot of choice, or being told that you're sort of only like accepted and worthy if you perform in a very specific way. And then a lot of kids have different ways of coping with that, and there's just so much there that can create little bits of painful experience that ultimately lead to a story that like, I'm not creative, I'm not worthy, I'm failing. And it takes a lot for the brain to sort of recover from that and go back into a space of being able to jump into creative engagement. And it happens because brains are amazing, but it takes time.
Yeah, well, and then that gets prolonged too, or can be, when parents become maybe vocal, or even their energy. Like you said, I mean, children are so perceptive, that when it feels disapproving, those are still the same kinds of messages that they're trying to recover from. And so sometimes we can end up extending that period by, what do they say? You don't pull up a plant to see if it's growing or whatever. If we keep trying to test, like, you sure you don't want to go out and play? You sure you don't want to do this? Like, they can tell that that's a judgment or an expectation, and we're not very comfortable with the choices they're making at that moment. So then there's that as well that they need to work through, isn't there?
Yeah. I think so I'll maybe add a little bit of a note that a lot of the work I'm doing in my life right now is around psychology and emotional wellness. So a lot of sort of the language I'm using and the way I'm thinking about these concepts is in sort of a frame of like trauma. And just to kind of make that transparent. But I love that idea, and I think that to me one of the most valuable parts of unschooling is the sort of unconditional positive regard and acceptance that a parent can give to a kid.
Yeah.
Just that sense of like really, as a kid, trusting that it's like okay to be myself and okay to do it feels good and take care of myself. Like that's such a huge thing to be able to give a young and developing mind. And a really, really precious thing. And it's hard to be able to do that as a parent, like really wanting to contribute to your kid as best you can. But it seems like one of the really impactful ways to contribute is to really trust a kid's process and give that sort of unconditional love and support.
Yeah, especially during that deschooling time, that the
Yeah,
initial set anyway. The just focusing on building that relationship and trust, like that trust lies at the root of everything. I love that you brought that up because that really is so important. Like when they feel that strength and foundation and trust from you, it's from there that they feel energized to step out, right? And to be able to follow what
absolutely.
they're, yeah, that's so cool. So I was curious how your passion for gaming developed, and I was hoping you
Awesome.
could share a bit about how that unfolded.
Yeah, we can get into the fun,
The
meaty
fun
stuff
stuff,
of
yeah.
gaming. Yeah, so uh, there's a bit to it. For me, there are, I think, sort of two really big things that made me sort of go wow when I discovered gaming. And one part of it was uh, influence from family. My cousins on my mom's side were really big video gamers, and they were I think between like 5 and 10 years older than me,
Hmm.
and in my eyes, they were just like the coolest people that could walk the earth. And so when they would visit, we would all sort of play together on our computers, whether it was like Warcraft 3, or sometimes my cousin would let me play Ratchet and Clank on his PS3 and or PS2, I think it was at the time. Anyway, so there was this sort of social element where these like really amazing people were showing me this really beautiful and artistic world that I could dive into, and it was initially this really social experience of getting to sort of play in it. Like you can almost, I think at first I thought of it as like a board game that just was so three-dimensional,
Ah.
um, and like there was so much sort of complexity and depth that I was diving into, and I was sort of collaboratively engaging with it with these people that I just really admired. So that was, I think, a huge component for me, and that continued to be an emphasis on how I engage with gaming throughout my life, was that really social component.
Hmm.
Um, the other piece of it I want to elaborate more on is I think that uh, a lot of that sort of growth process, especially right around the age where I left school, I think I was maybe 10 and up and through maybe 15 or 16, is this really sort of intense like period of trial and error of like seeing what it looks like to go into this uh, strange circumstance, and how that sort of reacts. And um, to someone of that age in particular, video games are this incredible opportunity because they offer this expansive sort of set of possibilities that you can explore. And the way the game sort of, so you, in a lot of these games, I don't know how many listeners have played video games before, so I'll maybe go a little bit basic, but in a lot of games, you're sort of, there's an avatar in the game representing you. And there's this really powerful state of immersion where sort of while you're playing the game, it's not necessarily that you, like in your head, you aren't thinking of yourself as looking at a screen, um, making sort of dots fly across. Uh, you are that character. You know, and often, like I think there's can be a similar experience if you're reading a really good book. Like
Yeah,
you
that's
kind
a
of
good.
become that character.
Hmm.
Um, and there's, I think, a similar sort of growth where for me when I was a kid reading stories, a lot of it was like, oh my god, what that would feel like, you know, to be
Hmm.
this character in this book on this great adventure. And then all sort of like the growth of feeling into that archetype and seeing what happens. And then video games introduce this whole new element to that, where not only are you experiencing this like incredible story from sort of a first person perspective, you are also making the choices about where the story goes.
Exactly.
So you get to choose for yourself what the most like creative thing you can think of is to do, and then you get to see what the results of that are. And I want to clarify, there's sometimes more to it than like, so let's say I'm in a game and it's like some kind of combat game. It's not necessarily that I am playing with the possibility of like fighting some guy on the street and seeing how that turns out for me, and then applying that to fighting someone in real life. It's, I think, more meaningfully seeing sort of which parts of myself I want to dive into and explore.
Mm-hmm.
And which parts of myself I want to grow, and sort of which aspects of that archetype of a hero and which parts of their story and their pain I can really relate with, and how that all feels. And I think that really supports, like, especially emotional growth and an understanding of sort of what it means to be human through living all of these stories through so many different eyes in such rapid succession.
And especially too, you can even replaying the same game. And I know my son would talk about doing different way playthroughs, making different choices, like taking on different personas, trying them on, seeing what happens to them through the same kind of story, but seeing how it plays out differently. And yeah, that's
totally,
it's a fancy, wonderful way to just explore. Like you were talking about exploring within the game too, and exploring just all the different perspectives that you can even play through sometimes in the different players' perspectives. You can approach your playthrough, with a different mindset. Oh, what if, and it's even like exploring that mindset for yourself, right? I want to play this. Like if I thought I was going to be like a superhero, what choices would I make here? If I thought I, wanted to become the villain, what choices would I make? And yeah, it's so in depth, isn't it?
Totally, and it's so powerful. Like I really want to reiterate that, like especially in I think a really good game, one of the things that me and my brother, who also love video games, would love doing was to go through a story as sort of the hero, and experience sort of the conflict from that perspective, and be trying to make these really like morally righteous choices and save everyone and help the world, and then also to finish the game and then go back through it from the villain's perspective, or like play as the bad guy. And I think in a good game, it'll really be apparent. Like you'll have the same sense of immersion as that villain, but you'll be like experiencing all sort of the like pain that the villain's in that leads to these like really harmful choices that the villain's making.
Because
and I think it gives this really broad understanding of conflict as a whole, which is just so cool.
I love that, because a well-drawn, well-created villain, believes he's the hero of his story, right? So as you said, he has all these conflicts, all these things going on. It's just such a way to realize that our perspective isn't the only one, right? What a way to explore that, even in our conversations and engagement with other people, they have different perspectives. It brings that home so clearly, doesn't it?
Yeah. I think one of the really powerful things about video games is being able to sort of take this, what's usually a linear storyline, and pull it apart to this like hyper complex like sort of sphere of conflicts and sub stories, and look at it from all different angles, and get to just really fully experience that story as like an example of what it means to be human. Just so cool.
Yeah, and I love some of those worlds are just so huge, and the stories so complex that the way they weave together, I used to love when, one of the boys would pass by and give me an update on a story.
Yeah,
What
totally.
twists and turns had happened and who was doing what now, and it's always so fascinating to listen to. I mean, and there's some games that don't do it quite as well, but I mean, that's another huge aspect you learn. Like you start to understand what it is that they didn't do so well that makes it maybe less immersive or makes the choices seem unrealistic or whatever. It's just a language, a whole world that you learn so much about, even just on its own, right? Did that make
Yes,
sense?
definitely. And it brings up for me, I think, a really important piece that sort of relates back to the difference between like engaging with specifically video games, either as a deschooling process or a sort of a
Mm-hmm.
passion-driven
Yeah.
choice. And one of the ways I see that happen is that sort of creative switch can turn on when you start to like view whatever media you're consuming as art and think about its creation.
Yeah.
And that same thing can happen for TV, where you start to, instead of just sort of blindly soak in what you're
Mm-hmm.
viewing, you're looking at it as this sort of intricate, um, sometimes masterpiece, sometimes terrible
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
example of the creation of a sort of an expression of artistry. And for some people who dive into video games, like I think one of my cousins who so inspired me, went on to be a really brilliant game developer. Yeah, so if you think of video games as three-dimensional books, there on one hand is sort of this huge sphere of stories and narratives weaving together from the perspective of the participants of the story. But then there's also the sort of story of the creators of the game itself. And it's just, I think, one more level at which you can analyze sort of the story. And it's so cool to get to see people who are sort of coming from this passion-driven unschooling mentality get to really dive into it as an art form and as a way of expressing their creative selves, and try their own sort of attempt at weaving these complex stories from multiple perspectives. It's really fun to watch.
It is. And I mean, like you said, there's just so many aspects to the whole thing, isn't there? I mean,
Yeah.
from the art to the, like, we'll have long conversations about the music and how the music
Yeah.
evokes atmosphere, and
Totally.
and how certain themes of music just spark and put you right back into the situation, the moment, like in that game where that song appeared, exactly what that was,
Totally. I
yeah.
had a really funny moment actually just yesterday. So I haven't at this point. I played some video games sort of off and on in my adult life, but haven't been as sort of serious about it as when I was a teenager.
Hmm.
But yesterday I was sitting in the living room. I live with sort of a collective house with a few housemates, and one of my housemates was goofing around with a recorder,
Hmm.
the flute instrument, and played this sound that sounded exactly like from one of the games I had played as a teenager. The start, like the intro note
Oh
to
yeah.
the combat music that plays, which like is so heavily drilled into me that like as soon as I hear that note, I like get ready for action. Like someone's about to try and fight me, even though I don't recognize what the threat is in the game world. So yesterday, like I heard that sound, and that like deep memory was stimulated for me. I like hopped up in my seat a little bit and like was terrified. There was probably some dragon about to breathe fire on me, and I had to get the heck out of there. Um,
Oh, that's so
yeah,
fun.
totally, totally. So yeah, it's all this really amazing art form, and yeah, I also want to talk a little bit about just like the sheer beauty of
Hmm.
games. I remember so many moments where I would walk. I personally really loved fantasy games. And there were moments where I would be in this sort of immersive world, and I would be like sort of walking down this trail looking for the next adventure to go on, and I would like crest a hill and see this like incredible sunset, with waterfalls and meadows and forest, and it was amazing to me to sort of capture that sense of very real awe that it was like, it's so similar to the sense I get of like going on beautiful hikes as an adult, and to have that stimulated sort of so regularly as a kid, and even though it was in sort of that digital context, was so fun. And I think not only that, it really sort of settled into me a passion for like discovery and for looking for those sort of overlooks in life, and finding those moments of awe, because it's such a beautiful experience, and I think really becomes just such a deeply satisfying thing. And it's so cool to me that that through video games that can be really accessible to like any kid who can venture into their computer.
Yeah, that's a great point. The exploration factor of it, right? The discovery, what's over the next hill, around the next corner, what's going to show up. It's so interesting. And to go back to the art and just the beauty of so many of the games. I know I would go sit and watch just to see, like, even I watched quite a few of the fantasy games where you're out in a cool world, but then even ones like inside a spaceship, and like just the detail, right? Just like, I watched Fallout 4 for a while, and I mean, even just let's go read all the posters, from ages ago, right? And you turn on the radio and the old music that was there. I mean, there's a lot of care that goes into these games, into a lot of the games anyway. Even some of the indie games where they don't have the budget for all that, but it's still beautiful, even in its own style. It's totally very stylistic. They still have their touches, the things you almost feel like you kind of, get to know the designers and the creators as you play, because you see what was important to them, right? You see what they focused on to bring out and everything. It's always so interesting.
Totally. And I think it's very true that you sort of build a relationship with the game designer. Like, I know that, like, for me and my brother, we loved Bethesda games as kids. And so now, like, that Bethesda hasn't released a new title in a while, but whenever they do, we get so excited. Knowing that these like storytellers that we really resonate with are creating again. Yeah,
no, that's awesome. Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on, because in my experience anyway, I think diving into any passion, which totally includes a passion for video games, can be a wonderful way to learn so much about ourselves too, right? And that understanding applies everywhere in our lives. We touched on it a bit in, the emotional resonance and navigating points of view and perspectives and relationships that way. But everything from, how do I deal with when I get frustrated, when I'm tired, hungry, all these everyday aspects of ourselves. It doesn't matter necessarily what the filter is through, and you experience all those parts of being human, the way you were talking about, of being human through video games as well, don't you?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. And to me, one of the really cool things about it is it sort of gives a way to sort of tangibly measure sort of different scenarios. So one example I can give is I used to play like shooter games. I played like Call of Duty. And I did an experiment one time as a kid where I played a game and I listened to like really hard and fast like rap music, And while I played, really like turned up loud. I noticed as I watched myself that I would like play super aggressively in the game. I like ran around all crazy, causing explosions and shooting things. And then I played another game and I switched and listened to this really like soothing, peaceful, like Jack Johnson or something. And I played super conservatively. And I didn't notice the difference until I went back and watched replays of the games.
Oh yeah.
But it was really cool to be able to just have this sort of way where I'm expressing my subconscious through sort of my subtle actions within a game, and then to be able to watch that sort of as an outside perspective is super cool. And then yeah, like you were also saying, being able to explore different sort of ways of making choices in one of those immersive games.
Yeah.
And different sort of archetypes you can try on. I know for me, as I got into a lot of the fantasy games, I just so fell in love with the idea of being an adventuring, exploring hero who went around looking for ways to help people and contribute to the world. And I think that that was for me the really big takeaway for a lot of the games I played. I ended up eventually, I think, I wasn't consciously thinking of it as like a real life video game, but when I was 18, I went on this long adventure. Part of that was I went traveling in Thailand for a few months, and I would go to these like little farms and help local farmers and volunteer here and there. And in my own way, I think was sort of an expression of that love I had for like seeing this new and beautiful place and looking for the people there who could use any help that I can offer, and like contributing to the space I'm in, and like just appreciating the beauty of that experience and process.
That's so cool. I love that how you noticed that later. You know, I'm losing the word, not connection, but anyway, someday it'll come to me. But yeah, between the similarities, maybe the similarities between those two things. That's a really interesting connection, and it leads very nicely into the next question, which was I was hoping you'd share some examples of the things that you learned or experienced through gaming that continue to be relevant in your life now. Like what threads you see now as you look back, the connections to gaming to where you are now.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the big ones for me is what we already talked a little bit about, which is conflict and perspective. Today I work as a sort of a mediator, and I work with sort of conflict and emotional wellness, and do a lot of sort of restorative justice work. And I think a lot of that was something I got to really like, the same sort of consciousness of being able to look into this really sort of delicate connection between two humans and see both perspectives and like value the needs expressed by the actions of each person. And I think that it's so similar to what I got to engage with as a kid, seeing stories play out from two different perspectives and getting to really put myself into the shoes of both the villain and the hero. So that for me was a really huge one. And I think also a big one was, like I said, that love for adventure and love for independence.
Yeah.
I noticed I was so happy in games where I got to like carry almost nothing with me and go. Like I was just so fascinated with just the concept, the idea that this person could have like enough food for a few days, if I sort of like break down what's happening in
Yeah.
sort of reality if an adventure going forward, this
Yeah.
person had like a backpack with some stuff and
Off they go.
like a few possessions and a little bit of food, and they just go, you know?
Yeah.
And if I ignore the parts about like fighting goblins, uh, the that sort of core component of there being this person looking for adventure and like not needing anything but themselves and what they have, and going and finding a really finding the biggest meaningful and sense of purpose in contributing to the world that they can with whatever they can bring, was so cool. Yeah, I think, like I said, I went on this long adventure when I was sort of coming into adulthood. Now I really love minimalism. It's mostly, I think, as a way of engaging with environmentalism, but I love just sort of trying to see how much I can contribute to the world with as little as I have. And so that's kind of one of the subtle things I think came for me. And then with that, just that love of like exploration and adventure and looking for ways to help people. I ended up in my life like going on a little bit of an unconventional route, which I'm sure is conventional for unschoolers to do. I skipped college, and I work in an unusual job, and I spend, I think, like slightly more time than I spend working professionally, volunteering. And for me, I think a lot of that comes from this part of myself that I got to express through video games, of being really committed to helping people and like having the most important thing be a sense of purpose and contribution.
Wow, I love that. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's awesome, Xander. I really do love that. So then, as our last question, as a grown unschooler, what piece of advice would you like to share with unschooling parents who are just starting out on this journey? I know we talked earlier about the cocoon phase, if that happens.
Yeah, totally. And I think that is such a big piece to, I think it's probably the biggest learning curve is having heard from sort of like our sort of cultural paradigm that as a parent, you're sort of like so responsible for your kid to be okay. Yeah. And if they aren't like behaving in a way like a kid on TV behaves, then you're a failure as a parent. And I think that a really big part of unschooling is sort of slowing down and learning to really trust in your kid and in the relationship you have with your kid, and to let that kid blossom in exactly the way that they want to and that they're meant to. And I think the most powerful thing any parent can do for a kid, in my opinion, is to be there, to sort of stand as this like smiling, supportive witness, and watch the kid grow into their perfect expression of who they want to be in the world.
Yeah.
And that can be really hard to do as a parent. That's a huge question, like a huge request to make. And I think there's like, I haven't heard research or stories that have led me to think there's anything else that comes close to having as much impact in a kid finding happiness and meaningful engagement in their life.
Yeah. I love that. I love that word witness rather than direct, right?
Yeah.
I really love that's a great way to put it. To be there and that positive, trusting, supportive, just So I guess supportive is it, witness to their lives and encouragement. And acceptance of who they are, right? That
Totally.
That's that huge piece, especially when you come from school. With school, there's this, model that everybody's supposed to get to, right?
Yeah.
Doing well and listening well and doing what you're told and everything, but to help them, to give them the space and time and support to find out who they are.
Yeah.
Right. That was great.
One of the projects I work on now is I volunteer in prisons, helping inmates to sort of get to know themselves and come into a greater sense of sort of like emotional understanding. And a really huge part of what we're doing there is giving this human a space to express themselves and be accepted, and sort of like learn to trust that they're safe in that room and that they're loved and belong, and that they deserve those things sort of no matter what. And if you can give that to someone while they're a kid, before they make a mistake, I think as humans, we're so like to have a sense of like safety in our body. It's so dependent on having a sense of belonging and having a sense of like family. And I think to let a kid know that they're accepted and that they're loved no matter what in such a tangible way as like really being there to support them and them making their own choices, like nothing can do so much to really set a kid free.
I love that. I got goosebumps. So true. So true. That's wonderful. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Xander. I really appreciate it. I love diving into gaming a bit with you.
Totally.
Yay!
So fun.
And before we go, where's the best place for people to connect with you online?
Yeah, if you'd like to connect with me more, you can reach me. My email address is xmacswan@gmail.com.
Excellent.
Yes.
Yes.
If you're in Portland, Oregon, and want to like see the work I'm doing or engage with me, you can totally reach out. My business's website is rosecitynbc.org.
Oh, excellent. Yes, I will share that in the show notes too.
Cool.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Xander. It was lovely to chat with you.
Totally. You too, Pam. Have a great one.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it helpful. You might also like the backlist episodes at livingjoyfully.ca/podcast. While you're there, be sure to check out the first book in my Living Joyfully with Unschooling series, Free to Learn 5 Ideas for a Joyful Unschooling Life. In it, I share the 5 paradigm-changing ideas that most help me better understand unschooling. Reviewers have said, a quick read, but packed with ideas that challenge the dominant paradigm of our failing approach to learning, this little gem makes an excellent argument for unschooling. And I was rather doubtful about this book, as I had never heard of the author, but after reading it, I wish that I had read it years ago. I hope you find it helpful too. Free to Learn has also been translated into French and Spanish. Until next time, have fun living and learning with your family.